You are listening to Abnormal Spaces.
I'm Donnie.
I'm Ryan.
In this podcast, we discuss conceptual realities, the researchers, authors, and explorers who describe and define them, as well as our personal experiences in these abnormal spaces. In this episode, we discuss the concept of sacred geometry. Before Charles Gilchrist, both Plato and Leonardo da Pisa played a part in understanding and popularizing what appears to be a divine structure that underpins our physical reality.
So what do you eat for breakfast?
Oats and honey, granola bars. It's the Nature Valley, the real crumbly ones.
All right.
Yeah.
I always wondered that.
Well, now you know.
I'm like, yeah, Donnie looks pretty healthy and good. Like, I wonder what he eats for breakfast.
I also have about 4 cups of coffee.
Oh, shit.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the secret.
They're that size. They're not huge cups.
Yeah. I'll have this one until my next coffee break around 4 or 5.
Well, see, okay, I don't have any coffee in the afternoon. Now, every now and again I will, but for the most part, I don't.
It's interesting how people live.
Yeah. Yeah. When we have dummy dust practice, because we don't even get started till about 7, and it's Friday night, which is a more tired night for most people, I'll have coffee then, and then that way I'm able to stay up until midnight.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, hell yeah. So now everybody knows a little bit more about Donnie.
That's right. I'm a pretty regular guy, and I like to attribute that to my morning routine.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, awesome. I'll have a piece of toast every now and then. Most of the times I don't have anything, which is apparent on the podcast days because I really don't know where I'm at. But that coupled with, I wouldn't call it early by any stretch. 10 o'clock is not early. But for the firing of this brain, sometimes it can be. But we get through it.
We do.
And we have editing, and it is just the best tool.
Yes.
It makes us sound so much better.
Much, much better. Speaking of toast, my son every morning has toast with avocado and sausage. Yeah.
That's the way.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. That's the good stuff.
I get this bread. It's a spelt bread, and it's just spelt, salt, and water. It's only like 3 ingredients, but it's sourdough.
That's good.
It's too expensive,
Yeah.
but it's old grain, so it's not. It doesn't mess with my belly or anything,
Yeah, it's easier to process.
And it's good for your digestion and stuff. So
yeah,
I dig it.
Yeah, I mean, spelt.
Yeah,
it's one of the ancient grains.
It's what's for breakfast.
Spelt. So we've talked a lot about different patterns that we've seen throughout antiquity and different designs, and we've talked about cymatics and those kinds of geometric patterns and stuff. One thing we haven't really talked much about is sacred geometry, and I think that is a really interesting term and like just a really interesting concept. So to take it back to kind of where it began, or at least where I think humans started talking about it.
Take it back.
Yeah, it actually goes back to Plato and his Platonic solids. So he identified 5 shapes that represented 5 elements. And one interesting thing about those shapes is any one of them, if you put it inside of a sphere, the points will touch the edge of the sphere. The other thing is they have all of these just phenomenal mathematical qualities. It's very orderly and interesting. One of those Platonic solids is the dodecahedron, which when we talked about ley lines in the episode about that was one of the theories about the Earth energy grid, was it was actually a dodecahedron, not like a 2D flat line across the Earth. But anyway, so Plato had these concepts, and Euclidean geometry was born, I guess, of some of those concepts that Plato had. And, Plato is fascinating. He knew about Atlantis. He seemed to know a lot about a lot. And if you think about the world at that time, a lot of the civilizations were somewhat removed from one another. So there were things going on in India and things going on throughout the Middle East that hadn't fully made their way to the Mediterranean. That's interesting because there was a guy named Leonardo da Pisa.
De
Pisa. From, yes, the town that had the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So anyway, he didn't design that. His father was a merchant. He did trading. They had some money. They had some means as far as their wealth relative to society. Anyway, so one of the places that his father had a trading post was Algeria. And in traveling to Algeria with his father, he learned about the Arabic or Indo-Arabic or Hindu-Arabic. It's got a lot of different names, but anyway, their numeral system. And so what he learned about their numeral system that seemed to be superior to the Roman numeral system, which is what Leonardo was accustomed to, was that it allowed for decimals. So it allowed for easier calculations of numbers and an easier way to grasp relative numbers, so like ratios and stuff like that. As he traveled around and went to other trading posts with his father, he began to talk to merchants, and they realized that this would be a better way of conducting transactions, figuring things out. These numbers make a lot more sense. He was a really, really intelligent person and a really gifted person, so he wrote this book called Liber Abaci, and in that book, he solved a great number of complex story problems and kind of walked people through it. Like, here's how you solve these problems. And one of the problems was this rabbit mating prediction thing. So if you have rabbits reproducing, they reproduce roughly every month. And so it was a way of determining how many rabbits in a particular amount of time you could expect them to produce. So like algorithms, fundamentals of algebraic thought, stuff like that. He should not be credited with it because they were already doing this in India hundreds of years before, but he can be credited with opening up the West and all of Europe to these kinds of thoughts. So anyway, he had observed when leaves grow from a sprout that they often grow in the same pattern, and that pattern is a sequence. And he applied that sequence to the rabbits, and it worked perfectly. And that sequence is known as the Fibonacci sequence. And he, Leonardo Fibonacci, he is referred to by a lot of different names, but Fibonacci is the one that we know today because that's the one that stuck, but it's his sequence. And that sequence has a really astonishing number of mathematical points of interest, mathematical computations.
So is it like 1, 2, 4, 8, 16? That's not
No.
Fibonacci.
No, it's 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 13. So what it is every two numbers in the sequence you add together. So it goes 1, 1, and then that makes 2, and then 3 because it's 1, 2, and then 2, 3 makes the 5, and then 3, 5 makes the 8, and then 13.
Oh.
Yeah.
I never, okay. I never put that together for some reason.
Yeah, no. Well, it gets crazier and crazier the more that you apply it to things, the more you understand. Now, the downside is that a lot of people in their rush to try to understand things will kind of shoehorn things into it when it really isn't it. And so a lot of classical mathematicians get really worked up about if you're not exactly 1.618 to infinity, then you can't count it. So if it's 1.62, it doesn't count or whatever. And I'm like, yes and no. I mean, here's the thing. All of this is based on base 10. Base 10 is based on the fact that we have 10 fingers. So it is a very human approach to understanding how the universe works. I feel like that is great and it's good for us to understand it that way. However, it
doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't really mean anything. Right. And the whole idea of an irrational number, which is what this is. So the Fibonacci sequence, or the golden ratio, the ratio within those numbers, it's one of those decimal that never ends. So on the one hand, you can consider it like, well, consciousness is infinite, and of course it never ends. The other side of it is, if we are just applying our very humanness to understanding this, then I don't really know how much weight I put behind that. But is it fascinating? Yes. Is it repeated everywhere throughout nature? Yes, very much so. There are so many buildings and works of art and stuff that did employ this. There are some that you look at after the fact and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I see where this fits. But there's others where, there's this Chinese, it's the Forbidden City. The rectangle, the main building, is based off the golden ratio rectangle. And in fact, the center where the throne is, it all mathematically works out to the Fibonacci sequence, essentially. So there are lots of them that can't be denied. And in my mind, that makes complete sense. There are other things that kind of work, like the Nautilus shell works. Other shells kind of work. But really quickly, going back to the sequence of the leaves and the way that they grow, one of the reasons that they grow that way is so that they're not on top of each other. Because if it went in an exact 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 pattern or whatever, leaves would grow essentially on top of one another and would choke out the sunlight from the leaves underneath. So instead, it grows in a spiral pattern. And we've talked about spirals before, and torsion, and the whole mechanism of the universe. And this is another example of that. And what's really cool is, if you look at the spiral pattern on a pineapple or a pine cone or anything else, you can count 8 motions this way, 5 motions that way, or whatever, and you'll always come up with that Fibonacci sequence. What's interesting to me is ancient civilizations, and right now I can't remember if it was Plato or the Euclidic geometry guy.
Yeah.
I can't remember which one it is, but
that's okay. I don't know.
But one of them correlated it to the Greek letter phi or phi, or I'm not Greek, but however that's pronounced, which incidentally, the visual of that is like the on-off. It's like a circle with a line through it, which is really just fascinating to me as well.
Phase.
Yeah. Well, so it's used in phase. It's the phi is used in so many things. It's used in wave function, which is a huge quantum physics property. But anyway, they had recognized that ratio, the 1.618, never ending. And they used that as a placeholder for that concept. Again, Fibonacci is often credited with it, and for good reason. I mean, he did bring it to the West, basically. He did further explain it in a way that more people could understand it. So he deserves credit for spreading it, but he didn't invent it. We started talking about Charles Gilchrist or whatever, and that kind of led us down this rabbit hole. He would do these mandalas, and there are certain versions of those that represent the seed of life, the tree of life, the egg of life, all of these different patterns, these complex patterns. A lot of people have found a shortcut to meditation via these mandalas. And so he was really big on creating these, and he wanted the world to know more about fractals, fractal energy, and the harmony of the universe via this sacred geometry. But a thing that I found even more fascinating than that was...
Even more fascinating.
It's hard to imagine, isn't it?
Oh, my God.
I know. Hold on to your hats.
Let me put this coffee down.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're seated.
All right. Let's go.
Metatron. I think the whole concept of Metatron is really, really fascinating.
Metatron.
Yeah, so...
It's a cool name, though.
It is. There was a local band here called Metatron.
Oh.
Yeah, I think Brett Seiler was in it. I can't remember who all was in it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Shit.
Yeah. Shout out to Metatron. Well, anyway, so Metatron, probably an alien, is in the texts of the three Abrahamic religions. And he was the scribe of God. And he is often depicted with a cube. And that cube came from his soul. And that cube has basically the map of the universe and understanding. So in working through geometric patterns, I believe it was Fibonacci, came up with Metatron's cube. Metatron's cube has 13 circles and 13 super mystical number. There's 13 cycles of the moon in a year, 13 menstrual cycles typically in a year, all the other things that 13 correlates to. Also, one of the numbers in the sequence. But anyway, within that cube, you can fit all of the Platonic solids as well. And it's not just a, hey, this kind of lines up if I squint and if I move. No, it's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. And so the idea that I started having, who was this character that understood this fundamental principle of the universe and then made sure that the people that were inhabiting the world at that time knew it and knew about it and shared it with them. And then later on, people found more ways that it made even more sense. And then it just kept making more sense and more sense. And I was kind of struck by that one. Metatron's always been interesting to me anyway, but the fact that I never knew anything about the cube and didn't understand that part of it at all. And then I'm like, wow, did some other entity or some higher vibrational consciousness, or what was it? And how was Metatron able to share this and people just take off with that knowledge and go from there? It's pretty interesting, to say the least.
It's kind of like stories across time. There's always something that's introduced that gives people knowledge.
Yeah.
Whether it's God or Metatron or any of it. But yeah, that is interesting. I mean, it's probably just like I guess a vibration of understanding maybe, because I think there's infinite understandings of things now. I'm just jumping points almost to let humans kind of evolve and understand a little more. Yeah. And I think there was probably a lot more of that before our recorded history. I am convinced that we are a reboot of a reboot of a reboot.
I am too.
So yeah. I don't know that for a fact, but I feel like that makes more sense to me than anything that I've been told or anything that I've learned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's frustrating because it seems like the knowledge keeps getting lost and then has to be relearned. So, it's unfortunate, I guess. But yeah, so when you think about cymatics, for example, and a certain frequency produces this geometric pattern, and usually if the tone is pure, the pattern is absolutely symmetrical. And you look at all of these examples of these patterns, whether they're the patterns that you see in cymatics or in these different geometrical patterns that you see, like I said, the tree of life and the seed of life and all that. When you start to realize that the people in these different cultures, whether it was India, China, Egypt, wherever, how they were using the same geometry to inform their buildings, their artwork, etc., it really does start to feel like that this is what it is all based on. And this is the understanding, like it's the underpinning of the entire fabric of the universe. And so you see some of these churches in Italy and all of the care that they took to actually employ this type of geometry, the sacred geometry, because they believed it was a connection to God, to the singular consciousness. And regardless of what they called it, that's what they thought it represented. And I don't have a reason not to believe that. I stopped short of calling it a God, but I do believe that there is some kind of universal underpinning, and this is a way to understand it. There are too many things that line up, but also when you think about how all of this came to be as we know it, you know, with the whole spiraling of the energy and how everything spins and how that spiral pattern is perfectly demonstrated by following the sequence. And then every other geometric form comes from that sequence or can be optimized via that sequence.
When I see things or when I hear things that kind of like resonate with me somehow, I don't know how they do. Even something as far out as, you know, vibrating buildings into being, which sounds insane. But if you look at cymatics, it's not really that insane.
No, not at all.
Because they're just touching on something that is like a raw version of a sound hitting a plate.
Right.
That sand or water is on.
Right.
And they're like, well, look.
Yeah.
Every time I do 12 kilohertz, this is what it makes.
Yeah.
So that's the beginning of that's creation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw this one breakdown of Metatron's cube, and specifically it started with the 13 circles in the middle, and it started with the first circle and went through the 6 days of creation first. So it tied in Genesis to that. It was really fascinating because you could draw this correlation of the story of the beginning of all. And it starts with light. Let there be light is the thing. There has to be movement before the light, but we're told there wasn't anything before the light. It's like so many other questions that you and I have discussed. Where is the beginning? There isn't a beginning because there isn't an end because it's all at once. But I find it really fascinating to try to tie in some of that Abrahamic concept of how everything came to be, and you can neatly overlay it into these 13 circles. It's really fascinating how that stuff works together, and how when you start to think of it as both a story that humans can understand and tell each other, and the way the energy and the waves of that energy and then their various frequencies, etc., and their various vibrations, put it all into being. It seems like most people, most humans, want there to be a plan. They want it to be that, okay, someone decided that this was how it was going to work, and then there was this plan. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, forget that. Look at how we can understand how the universe works, regardless of who, what, when, where. That's immaterial. Look at how it works and just focus on that. Start with that. If we can harness frequency, if we can harness energy, what all can we do, and how much more is out there just like this that we haven't even begun to understand yet?
Well, yeah, and then there's looking out and understanding that, and then there's looking in. There's that whole world, too.
Yeah.
It never ends. And, so you look out all the way until there's nothing, and then you look in all the way until there's nothing. So your point is nothing, but it's fascinating the whole way through all those realms or dimensions almost. Like,
Well, and, you think about how early man told stories to understand stuff and to explain stuff and to pass it down to the generations. It was all based on how they thought things worked. They didn't have any kind of arithmetic yet. All we know of is they had these oral stories they would pass, and they would observe the terrain and sky and come up with some explanations as to why things did what they did. And so until that language of math started, there was a way to explain things, but those things were more in a traditional story type, very anthropomorphized version of how things came to be. And then as people progressed in the most current reboot iteration of people, then they developed some arithmetic, and then they had yet another language to explain the things that they were observing. But this language allowed for the patterns to be repeated, tested, applied everywhere else, whereas those stories, it's a little bit different. You have these characters and you have this, action and consequence and all that. But with the language of math, you're able to do it in a completely different way and still tell essentially the same story.
I think that like the iteration that we are, like whatever the culmination of humanity at this point, I feel like there's such a big chunk that's been taken away that we're almost operating from a really not a great standpoint of what we're capable of as just conscious beings or whatever, like that we think we are. Like we just think we're like these people, and then we're in the world, and then the world's in the universe, and then we're all subject to all this like outside shit. And then you turn it, and now people are starting to see like, oh wait, no, all the outside shit is because of us and how we see it.
Yeah.
And so it keeps going like back and forth. And I think that we just don't have the tools. I mean, because, I like to fantasize about that shit sometimes. I'm just like, imagine what it would be like. We're going to build our city. Let's start out with this blueprint and let's do this. And and then you got all these people like with their minds all like zapped into this, It's just wild to think of that.
Yeah.
And people like hovering around on little things and what that used to be like compared to what we have now. And we think we have to work so hard for everything.
Yeah.
And we have to like chisel stone and, I just feel like we were caused to believe in lack and a lot of things were destroyed. I don't know. That's what it feels like to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it also feels like we often fight against the natural tendency of the universe. So like when you said chisel, like here's someone that takes iron ore, creates a chisel out of it, and then uses that to break up rock or whatever. And it's like you probably could have skipped a bunch of steps if you understood how the rock was being held together in the first place.
If you understood the rock wasn't a rock.
Right, yes.
Yeah, and you understood what made the rock be the rock. It's all atoms.
Right.
It's all the same shit.
Exactly.
So what frequency, what vibration, what pattern is holding it together? Like, what is this, the seeming stuff that makes the rock harder than, the dirt?
Right.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And that's like what they were working with, it seems like, at a point.
Yeah.
And it was just common knowledge. It was, and then, like the story of Atlantis, like you realize that kind of power and you realize that it is ultimate power, then humans are going to abuse it.
Right.
And that makes sense too to me.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. It feels unfortunate because it feels like we're missing out on something.
Yeah. Well, now our power is money.
Right.
I'm sure it was back then too, but maybe it was a different form of, maybe it wasn't money. Maybe it was just the status of like how powerful you actually were.
Right. Yeah.
Like you were a high priest. You were a,
right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you think about some of the tribes, the leader was the fiercest leader,
Right.
And you look at the animal kingdom and sometimes you have that, like you have the lion that is the king of the pride or whatever. There are some corollaries in the animal world, which we are a part of because we're animals. But
Yeah.
Anyway, the person that could then philosophize the best, at one point, Greek had all of these philosopher kings, from period to period. Then you have the people that can heal people, so there were shamans and high priests and stuff like that. And you have the people that claim to speak directly to God. And so they said, hey, God said this, and
Yeah.
I'm the person, and I'm the only person. And so you have to listen to me because otherwise you're not listening to God, and you're going to get in big trouble for that. So it's fascinating how it came to be that there was always some kind of central person or persons in control of a society or a culture or whatever.
Because of the lack and because of the poverty. And I mean, like, you just see it like any culture that's had like a really hard time of it, they tend to be really religious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that's the only light in that dark hole,
Right.
But that dark hole was created. I don't know if it's ever not been like that, but maybe there was a time where there was some harmony,
Yeah.
but it must have been at the very beginning.
Yeah, right.
Like Adam and Eve shit.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, it's wild to me. We've talked about that before too, about how people seem to need a leader, and people seem to really want just an answer. It doesn't even matter if it's right, if it is an answer that they can then proceed forward in their lives with, then that's good enough. And it makes me wonder, like, what the sequence of humans is, or what the pattern of humans is, and how do you arrange us into a pictogram, or like what is that? So there's a pattern. It's kind of like a quadrifoil, sort of the egg of life. And when cells divide at the point that they look like this, that's when life actually probably begins. I don't know. Life and consciousness are two different things. Consciousness doesn't begin or end, but the shell, the meat suit that we are in, absolutely begins and ends. I had never seen it presented in that way, and I found that really, really intriguing. And, again, it's really easy to try to just mash this stuff together and go, oh, look, here it is again. Oh, look, here it is again, as proof of whatever. But one, it doesn't need any proof. And two, some of them really do seem intentional, or just as if, hey, this is the way it is. You have now observed this, and this is the way it actually is. That and the effect of mandalas. Most people seem to report a calming or peaceful feeling after creating a mandala. Part of that is the kind of meditative state that you can get into, especially if you're making a really intricate one. But I think the other thing is just the pure beauty of the symmetry of the circles and the lines, and how it's so pleasing to us. It's almost like a visual harmony. Like we are now seeing something that awakens something, or calms, or sedates, or whatever, but we're having this reaction to it as if it was auditory, but it's visual. And I think that is really fascinating too.
Yeah, it reminds me of cymatics too, in the way that it would create maybe a brainwave state by designing certain mandalas, or making certain geometric artwork. The meditative state that you would be in to be there and doing it would play in, but then the like the blueprint is what you're making.
Yeah.
To sort of take it further, maybe, or I don't know. It is interesting. It's like you said, you're just looking at this thing, but actually it's a vibratory thing. So it's all of the senses. It's like all the stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's actually multidimensional.
Right.
Past where we can even see.
Right.
So
yeah. Well, and then you think about how all of that is around us all the time, and like how hexagons in particular are really interesting shapes to me. I mean, when you have beehives, but then you have places on Earth where the rock formations have just naturally formed hexagons. There's a planet that has a hexagonal pole. You see these shapes come up all the time, and there's something pleasing about the order in those shapes. Like when you see a triangle, for example, there's something, especially like an equilateral triangle, there's something very pleasing about that. It seems very orderly, and it I don't know, it speaks to a part of us that we are not in touch with.
Yeah. I mean, it's like telepathic or something.
Yeah.
It's just like the square contains whatever the fuck that is. Like you just look at it and it's just so primal.
Yeah.
It's just like,
yeah.
Yeah. It's like the building blocks of everything.
Yeah. That's at its core fundamentally what I think sacred geometry is. It's the language of math to explain the fundamental underpinnings that the universe is predicated on. It seems to exist within that.